Welcome into a summer edition of the Checkerboard Chat. It's been a while since we've talked to all you guys. I'm Ryan Schumpert, joined as always by Ryan Cruz. We are the co-sports editors here at the Daily Beacon, and it's been a hectic few months of kind of everyone wondering what's going to happen, and we're starting to get some clarity this week, and we'll jump right into it. Big Ten announcing yesterday, Pac-12 or Big Ten announcing on Thursday, Pac-12 announcing today that they're moving the conference-only schedule. There's been a lot of rumors out there that the ACC is going to follow suit pretty soon with the Big 12 and SEC holding off for now. But if you don't have any big teams to play out of conference, I think they're going to be their hands going to be forced to follow anyway. But Ryan, what was your first thoughts when you saw that yesterday?
I just don't know how much of really an impact this will be in terms of their, they say it's to combat the virus, and I kind of get they say maybe possibly, a uniform standard between the conference. Maybe it's hard to control other conferences, but I think and the other big thing they're talking about, minimizing the travel. Well, I think the biggest thing that stands out is you look at a school, with the ACC, a team like Clemson. Well, now they're not, hopefully they get saved, but, they're not going to travel to go play South Carolina, which is a short little bus ride, but yet they're probably going to still go play games in the Northeast.
Yeah.
And God forbid the SEC go conference, obviously I hope they don't. I think cooler heads will hopefully prevail there, but you could have a situation where someone, Georgia, Florida aren't going to play their rival who is within, a couple of hours driving distance for an hour for Georgia, but they're still going to go play at Mizzou, and South Carolina's not play Clemson, but they'll go play Texas A&M, and it's just a wild thing. But again, there's so many wild things going on right now.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's kind of ironic, honestly. The two most regionalized conferences, the SEC and the Big 12, where obviously there is, like you were just saying, in a lot of cases, still a good amount of travel. But in general, the two most regionalized conferences aren't the ones that have come out and announced that they're going to conference only. That's been the Big Ten, which stretches from Nebraska to New York or I guess New Jersey and Rutgers. And then, like you were just saying, the ACC all the way up from Syracuse down to Miami. And Pac-12 is, basically the same thing on the West Coast. I think it's partially a financial decision. You look at it, most of these teams have one, maybe two big out-of-conference games, whereas they have three other small ones. And is Tennessee going to want to pay Charlotte, or are they going to want to pay Furman $2 million when they can't put anybody in the stands, which right now seems to be looking less and less likely by the day. Hopefully in a month and a half we have things maybe more under control that could possibly happen. But right now I think that looks unlikely, and I think that, as well as maybe buying some time, postponing the season for a few weeks, which just cutting out non-conference games could do, is really the main motivation right now. Obviously, player safety is being taken into the circumstances, but like you were saying, a lot of that is how much of that's really actually helping player safety when you're still traveling at a big rate. And, I know the Big Ten was saying they're going to do 10 conference games, and if the SEC follows suit, maybe the games you're trying to add more bus rides for teams, and where maybe Tennessee plays Auburn and Ole Miss. But at the end of the day, some of that's just going to be, it's an East and a West for a reason, and obviously Missouri is kind of the one outlier there, but it's going to be hard to fully hold and rein that in, I think. Another thing I think is going to be interesting to watch with that is, the independents, Notre Dame, BYU. How does that, Army, Air Force, how is that going to work? I know the ACC, Notre Dame already had 6 games against ACC teams this year. I think I saw the ACC is working towards still playing those games. But if not, what does that look like? Do you think there's a chance that we can get some of these matchups between, I know South Carolina's been talking about it, still wanting to play Clemson, Florida, still play Florida State. How exactly do you monitor those things, and how tricky does that make it for conferences to figure things out going forward as we get really just about 2 weeks from the start of training camp.
Well, I think so. The first thing is, Notre Dame. I have heard reports that John Swafford has said they will look at the possibility of accommodating Notre Dame. Adding, letting other teams play Notre Dame to get them up to a respectable number of games. And I think one of the biggest obstacles that I've seen for the teams like South Carolina, Clemson, and Florida, within the SEC, from the SEC side, is finding games for those other schools like Tennessee, Mississippi State, Ole Miss that don't have a in-state rival in another conference. And how does that work with the other teams like that? Because you want to create some equity. You don't want to have these other teams that just so happen, because the way it shakes out that South Carolina, Clemson, whatever, South Carolina, Florida, they get an extra game. So I think it's trying to create some equity there. But there's so many moving parts, and I think it's just something we're all going to figure out as it goes.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues we've seen this whole time is just how there's a lack of common. There's no one decision maker. Seems to be very little strong communication between conferences. So, and the NCAA's taken a very hands-off approach to things. I mean, the statement they released yesterday was, basically just said absolutely nothing about the Big Ten going to it, just saying they support whatever the conferences decide to do. So they're kind of left on their own, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of good, meaningful communication. I know the Big 12 commissioner said on Thursday morning, or they had a call with the Big Ten commissioner on Thursday morning, and they show no signs that they were going to go to conference-only schedule later that afternoon, and obviously that's what ended up happening. So that's going to be something to watch. I think that just what makes college sports even trickier to try to maneuver and figure out things in this COVID-19 season, COVID-19 world, and something that will certainly continue on into basketball season too. On to the second thing, COVID-19. More Tennessee players were tested this week. Up to this point, no football players have been tested positive. I don't think Tennessee hasn't announced the results of the test this week. Will be interesting to see what happens there. It seems very strange that Tennessee hasn't had anyone tested positive. I know some schools like Florida State aren't disclosing that information, but Tennessee's been open about it. They've been open about it in other sports. Obviously, 2 basketball players have had it. What have you really taken from that, and how sustainable is that and going forward, do you think?
I think, with a team like Tennessee who has not had a case yet, there's more of a gamble. Not that they can choose, we want players to not have it. But you look at a team like Alabama or Clemson who have had high numbers of cases. Okay, you kind of know what you're going to get. You're not really going to see, huge spikes come, mid-season. It's kind of come through the team. You're pretty close to herd immunity. But you're a team like Tennessee. We've seen that this virus is a lot more widespread. It's very easy to catch. So I think at some point there will definitely be. I don't want to say for sure, but it's almost statistical, highly likely that there will be cases on the Tennessee roster, later on, and so I think the gamble is that possibly by the time that they start getting cases, that there's come to be a consensus of, okay, we know how to deal with it. We know the facts. We know how it affects college-age kids, especially college-age kids who have a high level of fitness like the Tennessee football players do, and all college football players. So I think it's definitely, you kind of know more where you're getting with teams that have kind of started to see the cases. But it's kind of more of it's a greater unknown for those teams who haven't had the cases yet. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And it'll kind of depend on where the country is at the time they start to get cases.
Yeah, and I've I'm not the first person that's had this thought, and I'm not set in stone on it, but, I think a lot of people think that it's better to have your players get COVID now. And I think from a football on the field standpoint, that's almost certainly true. You get closer to herd immunity if you have it now. The thought is you can't catch it again. I'm not a doctor. I'm not sure that's true, but at least in the fall, the thought is you're not going to catch it. You're not going to get it. But what's even more off the field, and I just think curious, is once everyone gets back to campus, and that seems to be how things are still headed in the SEC, at least at Tennessee, I'm not sure how much you really can control it. Whereas now you have players, basically just athletes on campus. They're doing, or at least coaches are doing their best to have them not in harm's way. I think that's a lot harder when you get back to school, and I think it can become much easier a snowball effect. And I think that's where teams, coaches, administrators are probably worried that you could easily have 10 people on your team catch it in a week, and then another 7 the next week, and then you have 17 guys out for a game that can't play for 2 weeks. And then that's just I don't know, 17 you probably don't have to forfeit, but certainly a huge disadvantage. And I just think the unknowns that come with having COVID and having that run through your team in the fall are probably bigger than they are now. Like you said, that gives you a little bit of time to see how other people handle it, figure out the best way. So there's certainly some pros and cons there, but I think it will be very interesting to watch going forward.
And you talk about the different climate. I can definitely speak as someone who played college football, at a lower division, but still, we got to campus 2 weeks before everyone else. And so it was us, the 2 soccer teams, the volleyball team. And it was a much quieter, area on campus. Coaches could kind of have a lot more control. Pretty much everyone there was under the thumb of a coach. So you're not going to see massive parties or anything, it's a much more subdued climate, but when you could definitely tell the difference, come, a couple days before class starts, just the campus life just changes so dramatically. So it's definitely that's something you could see.
Yeah, it's certainly just a lot more less control coaches and administrators are going to have over the situation once everybody comes back. Hopefully, you don't have any huge outbreaks, but it's hard to know. And everything that's going on right now, it's just hard to say anything definitively. Moving on to a little bit of actual football, working on the assumption that Tennessee gets back on the practice field here in the coming weeks. Where is some position groups, some players that you're really watching, that are going to be interesting to see with the lack of spring practice and the lack of normal summer workouts for the players?
So I think obviously your first things you think of are going to be the position groups that have new coaches that are facing a lot of roster turnover. But as far as I'm concerned, I believe the most impactful position, as is typically, for any spring practice, is going to be the quarterback position. As you saw throughout last season, Jared Garantano was a little inconsistent. Same with Maurer, Shroud. Again, there was widespread consistency, and you had, 6 guys playing their, volume for playing time there. And so, spring practice definitely could have given them the ability to great confidence. Very likely Garantano will be the starter come opening day, just because of, the uncertainty. Typically you ride with the horse that you have.
Yeah.
That's led you, there for those last couple games. But as, is that going to be sitting in, lagging in his head, hey, all this inconsistency? Good spring could have helped him overcome that. Whereas he's coming in here, still not really solidified, calls from the fan base for change. So it's definitely, also Harrison Bailey, there's some promise there. So it's just going to be, it's the quarterbacks comes a lot more shakily than they would have had. They were able to solidify that during spring practice.
Yeah, one of the things I think with the quarterbacks that's going to be interesting is just how many of them there are in the room. Obviously, you have 4 of them on scholarship with Shrout, Maurer, Garantano, and Bailey, and then you also have Casem Hill, Jimmy Jimmy Holiday, excuse me, was a guy that was supposed to start there. Now there are some rumors that he's already moved the receiver, which would make sense. But how does Tennessee manage those snaps, those reps in practice to get everyone time? Because obviously, and that's what more than anything spring practice is for. While also, I think most people felt like spring practice would weed out a quarterback and someone would transfer. Now you're going into fall, and as much uncertainty as there is at that position, as well as the receiver position from Tennessee, when you lose your top two pass catchers from a year ago, it makes you need to rep who is going to be playing a lot to get in rhythm with the players, but you also need to continue that development. And like you said, there is so much uncertainty of who, Garantano, I think we all believe is going to be the starter game one, whether that's against Charlotte or Florida or whomever. But that doesn't mean he's going to start all 12 games, and he's shown, like you said, in a lot of inconsistency, and I think it would be foolish to think that there's no chance anyone else could play there. So that's just a tricky situation. Flipping the other side of the ball, I think inside linebacker is going to be a really interesting spot, and a lot of guys there could have used spring. A lot of young players, not a lot of depth. Obviously, Henry To'oTo'o is all-conference level player, really high-level player, but besides him, who's going to be beside him? I think Quavaris Crouch seems like the most likely possibility, but he's a guy who didn't play inside linebacker much last year, only kind of in a reserve role, mainly played outside linebacker, and a guy that hasn't played a whole lot of defense in his career as he was a big-time running back in high school in North Carolina. And then who else can step up there? I think there's a lot of thought that Jeremy Banks is going to be back on the team. I know he's, backlisted in the Tennessee system, but he's a guy who hasn't played football since the Chattanooga game last year before he got kicked off the team. And then after that, you have a lot of young guys behind him. Bryson Easton, a freshman, Martavius French, a freshman. Who can they get to step up there and really help things? And a new position coach, too, to mix into all of that with Shelton Felton. So a lot of moving pieces, a lot of question marks there. Question marks not always a negative, and it helps that you have an all-conference player already set in stone, penciled in at the one linebacker spot, but who starts at the other one is a very big question, and Tennessee also needs to develop some depth. Another guy I failed to mention, J.J. Peterson, big recruit a few years ago, pretty talented, hasn't really put it all together. Another guy that just practice time is so important for.
And another thing is you talk about the linebacking core and how To'oTo'o is already there and has some experience. But I think one thing you got to factor in is he's had experience as the second linebacker, as the co-pilot. So I definitely think spring practice would have been a great time for him to get mental reps, physical reps, just the entire mindset of being the pilot of the defense. It's a different. It's one thing to be there next to the guy who's controlling everything and watching and learning. But to be able to, now it's you got the reins and you got to run this. It's one thing to know, okay, I got this, but that time it can be invaluable for a young guy like that. And
yeah, certainly. More of a broad question here, but conference wide, nationwide, and maybe if you have anything specific at Tennessee you'd want to add in, go ahead. But do you think we'll see less freshmen play this fall just due to the lack of spring practice and the lack of organized, full team together stuff in the summer?
I mean, I think you're going to see it's going to be interesting. I think I would lean that yes, you're going to see more freshmen, or less freshmen. But then also, who knows with player being pulled out because they're tested positive, so you might see more on that side.
Yeah, good point.
More from. But I think from a game plan, you'll see less, but possibly from the starters have to quarantine. I think you see more freshmen there, so it's interesting which one will have more of an effect.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a balancing act, and it's really a position. Looking at it specifically with Tennessee, I think it's where Tennessee is very much benefited by how much returning depth they have along the offense and defensive line. typically those are the hardest positions for a freshman to come in and play, probably especially this year. Whereas some of the opportunities for playing time, less depth areas on the team like receiver, linebacker, you have some talented guys there who you hope can get accustomed to things and hit the ground running a little quicker. Obviously, every player is different, but just in general, that's the trend. One last thing to get to on the recruiting front. It's been slow for Tennessee after a wild May and June where things seem to be going at 150 miles per hour. But speaking more on the recruiting calendar, what do you think that looks like if NCAA still hasn't announced any plans to open things up? Do they have visits in the fall? If you're saying it's not safe enough for fans to be in the stands, is it safe enough to bring high school players in? And, the high school seasons in a lot of states are up in the air. I think Tennessee's is going to be shortened, but still played, and a lot of the southern states are still going on with it, but a lot of question marks there. How do you think the NCAA monitors that?
So I think the two biggest effects are going to be on there. So the one front, I believe recruits are going to choose schools closer to home, not necessarily because of a desire. Oh, I want to be close to home. I'm scared of the virus, but I think more so, the schools that are closer to you, the area better. And a lot of times, I feel like a lot of these guys who go far is because they travel to the school and they're impressed by the facilities or this or that. And I don't think you're definitely going to have less than that. And the other front is, I believe, I think you're going to see less, fans at football games. I've already seen, I believe New Mexico already canceled their season. It was in Mexico already canceled their football season. So that's going to be interesting. So I think you see more of that prior performances, in past years. You're going to see the importance of camps, and then I think the first thing is you're seeing less attention for late bloomers who would typically come out in their senior year. This could be their shot to get that offer that they really dream of, or to move up the ladder. And so I think this could definitely shake up. I think there's going to be a lot less precise of a recruiting cycle.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's a good point on the players staying closer to home, especially, To'oTo'o is one of those guys, and Tennessee's done it some, but, Georgia and Alabama schools that recruit more nationally and go out to California and get kids on the West Coast, it's hard-pressed for, even there are visits, official visits, which I think at some point there is going to be. If you just go visit a place once, I think it's really hard to decide to go there, whereas usually you have unofficials, guys will make big southern tour trips in the summer. They'll go visit 4 or 5 schools. You get a chance to see things, get more feel, get more comfortable, when you're there for the second visit, and you're not seeing everything for the first time, and that could create opportunity for schools like USC and UCLA, really any number of schools at the West Coast. That opportunity is there. I know USC and Clay Helton have recruited well this year after a pretty abysmal class last year. So that'll be interesting to watch. Another thing, if you're not having visits in the fall or they're pushed back, is the NCAA going to get rid of the early signing period for this year and not let kids sign in December? Are they going to, I think it's easy to say we still have the signing period in February. We're not going to get rid of it. They can sign whenever, but that's the reality of the situation is these kids get pressured into signing all the time at schools in December, even when they maybe would feel more comfortable waiting. Alabama and Nick Saban, not to pick on Nick Saban, every school does it, might say, we don't know if we're going to have a spot for you if you wait till February. And I think that becomes even more of a concern now just because all of the uncertainty. So I think it will be very interesting to watch. Another thing, I think you'll have probably the most inaccurate recruiting rankings, at least inexact recruiting rankings, this year that you'll see in a while, just because no summer camps no Rivals camps, 247, ESPN camps for those guys to evaluate kids, and then obviously going to be harder to get to watch players, I think, this fall, at least in person, even if there is a high school football season.
And another thing is, I think, you got to think about it this way, is even if there are visits, like you're talking about Alabama, Georgia, all these schools, they recruit nationally. Well, you have guys who are, they're pretty good guys over 10, 12 hours away by car. And, what if they want to bring them in for a visit, but their mom or dad or someone who's kind of along with them has doesn't feel safe. They have a pre-existing condition or something, and they don't feel safe flying. And, am I really going to, take a 12-hour drive? Maybe. And maybe if you're really into Alabama, but, that could be like, no, never mind, I'm going to go visit somewhere else. That could, definitely, create more regionalized recruiting.
Yeah, I think especially with the, how important it is to get family members on campus and comfortable with situations, I think it's something where it could really pay dividends if you've already done that. I think early in the process, kids obviously take visits up to 3 years before, their sophomore year of high school. But a lot of times they're not getting a lot of one-on-one time and parents aren't there. But, especially I think that's something you saw has helped Tennessee. Just the last week before things died down, Hudson Wolf, tight end from out in West Tennessee, and his whole family was on campus for a visit. Tennessee parlayed that into getting his commitment about a month ago, and then another guy that was there that last week was Caden Salter with his whole family and the quarterback who committed to Tennessee back in May over Auburn. So obviously they were able to get that comfort level, and I think having already had family members, parents more particularly on campus, having them comfortable with the coaching staff and the situation there is really going to pay dividends because, just like you said, you don't know, it's so much uncertainty. You don't know if those adults are going to be able to make visits again in the winter, especially when, again, I'm not a health expert here, but people are anticipating another wave of things to get kind of bad when it goes with flu season, which obviously coincides with when recruiting is heating up at its very peak, in which, all back to your original point, I think could really push a lot of more players to end up staying closer to home, not necessarily in state, but in a 5-hour bubble of where they live. I think it could make a really big difference. That is going to do it for this edition of the Checkerboard Chat. Appreciate you for joining me and Ryan Cruz on a little summer edition, talking a little bit of uncertainty of the football season, while also getting into a little bit of specifics about Tennessee if we hopefully have a season this fall. Thank you for joining us.